and all the different supplies that I use when I do leather working. My snaps, my findings, my rivet tools. There's going to be a tray in it, and I'm going to make it with white oak that I have from these old steps. I'm going to recycle this old white oak. I bought a bunch of wood once, and in the pile of wood were about 20 of these steps. It's an inch thick. It's really good. It's laminated together, so each piece is a few different boards. So I have to contend with a couple of biscuit joints throughout all of this wood. But it's great wood, and it smells really nice. And you see that rib there is in each one of the pieces, so I have to work around that. And what I'm making now are the short sides and the long sides. 2 short sides, 2 long sides of this box I'm making. It's going to be about 25 inches wide and about 12 inches deep and about 12 inches high. And the first thing I'm doing is I'm planing them. And if you notice how when I plane to avoid snipe, I try and put them all right behind each other. It reduces it. It doesn't eliminate it because, of course, the last piece still has snipe on it. But these boards, I basically took at least a quarter off, if not maybe a third, to make them slimmer. Because I'm going to make this toolbox, I don't want the thing to weigh 1,000,000 pounds. Right there, what I'm doing is I'm trying to get the center of that piece of wood. So you notice how I just nick the blade one way and then I nick it the other way, and then I know I'm in the center. These boards, I'm just trying to get as much yield out of them. These are going to be the boards that become the top and bottom of my toolbox there. Brett is off camera grabbing the pieces out of the frame. And there I cut everything that's going to become the top, the bottom of the tray, the sides of the tray, and so now I'm planing all of them as well. Here I'm just trying to get them to a consistent thickness. And again, when I plane, I try and throw as many things through there. You see, I'm avoiding snipe by having those pieces all staggered the way I do. And now this is day 1. I finished everything. Okay, that was in New York City, and now I'm at my new shop in upstate New York, and it's this big building there in the center. And this actually is the very first time I'm cutting anything in this shop. There's one outlet at the moment, and I have a little studio light plugged into that outlet, and this router. I have a big porta-cable router that was provided to me by Rockler, and I'm working on the Rockler router table. For this part of the project, the finger joints are kind of big, the pieces are broad and heavy, so I made my own router jig. It's just a little bit bigger than the one Rockler sells. You'll see me use that later. And you'll notice here that very first cut when you're doing a staggered finger joint, sometimes the first cut is just the bit itself right on the edge of the open wood. And you'll notice I'm using the screw clamp here right here, you see it? Because that piece of wood is going to get pushed around, and you don't want it to push around. Now I'm resting on the peg, so I have the security of pushing it into the peg. And there you see that. And I just go over the joints a couple times just to make sure that any kind of wobble in there gets cleaned up. Same thing there. Well, there I had the use of the peg to keep me secure. And I did a lot of tests off camera with that to make sure I got it right. And here I'm using Type Bond 2. I don't like Type Bond 3. It kind of dries weird, but I like the consistency of Type Bond 2 better. And everything just taps together. I like them when they're a little bit snug. You don't want them so snug that you have to hammer them apart and you can't take them apart. You want some room for the glue. Also, if you hammer them together too tightly, you could create some cracks there in the surface. And before I clamp them together, I make extra sure that everything is square. So I'm constantly checking square. And get it all in there. And then I use a wet rag to clean up all of the glue. And here you'll see me, usually I use a shim, a wooden shim, but in this case I use a paint scraper. I put it inside of that and I get right there on the corners, because that's always the problem. You don't know what's in there until later on you try and paint it and you realize you still got glue in those joints. And now that's dry, and I'm just using a belt sander to cut down those joints that are sticking through. I always make the joints proud a little bit, maybe a couple of millimeters or a millimeter proud, to sand them. And then you see I did a little jig there so I can get the finger joints on the short side, because it's too tall to just try and stand on its end and belt sand. It's going to wobble all over the place. So I lower the whole center of gravity by just putting those stakes of wood sticking off of the table and just resting it right on there. I've done this before. A couple of years ago I did a bunch of production whiskey boxes, a few hundred of them, and I had to do the same thing. And there you go. The finger joints all look really nice, and the box is certainly very strong. Now I'm working on the other side. Where did I go? There I am. And you know, you got to be careful not to burn. Whenever you're belt sanding, you'll see I did do some burn, but you just lighten up, you stop pushing as hard, and you just kind of go gently. And now I want to make sure that top and bottom are nice and flat. And if you're really out of whack, you could work on it with a hand plane, but I was very close. So I made this sanding board, and I usually do these sanding boards and drag over the surface with a couple of weights on top. And the weights I have there are just big old screws, or the actual nut for screws. Palm sanding everything. And there you see some of the biscuit joints that were buried in that wood. There you go. And so now I'm going to make the top, and the top is just going to be a bunch of planks planked together at about 3/8 of an inch. This box ends up being pretty hefty ultimately. And I'm just lap jointing them. Notice I'm just making space so that they lap joint. I wanted to make sure that they were wide enough so that once I lap jointed them, I didn't have a skinny little piece. So the top is going to have 4 pieces just because it's the finished side. And when I do the bottom, I'm going to have a lot more of the scrap, various different pieces I have. This is my Veritas shoulder plane. I'm just making sure that I get those nice and snug together. And this is a trick I always use when I glue big broad pieces of flat stock together. And you'll notice there's just basically a wedge. And I glue everything, and then I hit that wedge, and it just goes up the ramp and tightens everything. And in this case I have 3 broad panels to glue. I just glued what was going to be the top, so there's 4 pieces. And now this is the bottom, and then eventually off camera I glue the 3rd part, which will be the bottom of the tray. And you'll notice this is kind of the smaller pieces of scrap. Square it all up, tighten the jig, and then just leave all the weights on there. And there, that's how I get the jig out. And there you go. There's my finished glued up thing. And I'm using a cabinet scraper to get all the glue bumps off. Sometimes when you work with oak, you tend to stain it with water and clamps and glues, especially when you put steel near glue. The steel tends to stain the oak. You got to be careful of that because sometimes it goes really deep. So I'm gluing them in place, and then I just put weights on them to hold them in place. And now I'm routering them. You'll notice I'm conventionally cutting, but I'm being very cautious. I don't go back too far. I don't want to pull a big splinter off. When I say conventional, I'm cutting the way you might assume it should cut. You got to be careful on your corners because you'll pull them apart. So always go to the corners first is what I do, and then I work away from the corners. And to hold the top in place for the long term, I'm going to nail it in place. I have these 1-inch nails with a little black head on them. I like them. I like the way they look. I was inspired by a lot of the old toolboxes I buy at flea markets and garage sales. I have probably 25 antique toolboxes. I just like that every single one of them was handmade by the person that carried them. And that sort of was my inspiration here. And this is just a simple box. I didn't want to get crazy like some of the other boxes I've made with big rails around the top and bumpers and stuff. This is just a box that's going to carry some spools of thread, some findings, some rivets, a couple of small tools. But I also like the way the hammer sounds when I speed it up. Let's listen. Pre-drill everything because you don't want to split all that wood. All those nails together will make up one big split, so you want to pre-drill them. And the way I like to do things is in organized fashion like this, by putting everything in place and then going to the nailing portion, sort of the production side of me. It's a lot of fun too. And there you go. And I like the look of the nails. I really like the way that looks. And now I'm going to open my box up. This is going to be the lid. I'm back up in my shop in upstate. I went back and forth between the 2 shops probably 4 times during this build. It's been a busy move. It really takes up a lot of my energy and my time. And now I'm going to cut what's going to become the sides of the tray. And that's my battery operated DeWalt 60 volt. Works great. And now here you see the smaller finger joint jig, and I use it with a 3/8 bit to make the finger joints for the tray. And that's secured to the actual rocklet table. I'm cutting it perpendicular to the table groove, whereas before I was using the actual table groove as my slider. So very versatile to have those different options. And now here you see me assembling the tray. And Rockless sells these cauls for clamping finger joints, and you see those bumps in there? Those bumps are designated to land right where you need them to. And again, I use the 3/8 bit, so they have them in 3/8, quarter, and I think 1/2 inch. And I'm just making sure I get glue everywhere I need it, and I have a snug fit. You can see that glue pinch out. And there are the cauls in place, and then it comes with a ratchet strap. And you wrap everything, ratchet strap it together, and you give it a couple of taps with the hammer and a couple of cranks down with that. And everything gets pulled into place. It pushes exactly where you need it. So now I'm back in the city shop, and I'm using that sanding plate is screwed to the table, and I'm using it now to clean up that cut between the top and bottom. I'm getting rid of all the swirl marks from the saw blade. And I don't like to do a hand plane there because you might take out more than you need in a certain spot. You'll see by the end I didn't get it absolutely dead perfect together, which I was hoping to, but at that point it was a little too late in the build. And so now I'm making the pockets for these hinges that you can get at Rockler. These are nice, beautiful, I think they're from Brusso. And whenever you got to remove material, I sometimes am a little too afraid to put a router to the top of this. I'm afraid I'm going to lose control of it. So with this chisel, I just remove a little bit at a time. Make sure, and I got to go a little deeper than the actual thickness of the brass on those hinges, because when the hinges are in the closed position, there's an air gap between them. So I've got to make up for that air gap. So it's the width of the top and bottom of the hinge plus the air gap. And you'll see later what I do with the air gap. I put a little piece of plastic in there to keep the hinges parallel in space. Always cut the cross grain with a razor blade. In this case I'm cutting with the grain because that's such a skinny little piece. The hinges go just on the inside of that. It ends up being probably about a 1/16, 3/32 thick. And there you go. And I go off to sharpen the chisel, I remember at that point. Now here you see, I crazy glued them in place for just a moment, so that's just super glue. And there you see I just put a little bit of plastic in there as a spacer. And then when I open the hinges, I take the plastic out. And pre-drill always when you use brass screws, because they will break when you least expect it. In fact, I didn't do it in this case, but sometimes I use a steel screw, drive it in there, that's the same size, then remove it, then put in the brass screw, just to ensure that it doesn't break off halfway in. Even though I drill it, sometimes in oak, you will lose half of a screw into the hole, and then you have no recourse. Especially when you just spent a half hour digging a hole for it, for the hinge itself. Now this is a little bracket that's going to keep the lid open. I'm not sure what that would be called. And this was a little bit of a difficult installation, but I worked out nice. This is a 1/4 inch chisel. I drill the front and back of the pocket I'm going to make, and then I just go to town digging out that pocket with a 1/4 inch chisel. Just try and stay on course. It's not easy for me. I don't really have the delicacy of a fine woodworker. I sort of have the delicacy of a metal worker working in wood. That's why I find it so comfortable working in metal. But here, take a look at that. That's a cool new snap. It works so beautifully. And here I'm using a plunge router, I think for the very first time in my life. With an 1/8 inch bit, I'm pocketing out for those Brusso clips. These things are really the most sexy clips I think I've ever used. They were just so satisfying when you hear that snap. And I had a good tight line to follow, and that's it. You just stay on the line. You stay on the line, it's amazing how much it works. And there I am. Those are just snugged in there right now. They're still not glued in. Here I'm just using 2-part 5-minute epoxy, getting them in there, and making sure everything fits, everything feels right. At one point I had to put a piece of tape on it because the lid kept opening, and then I just taken some sawdust and jamming it in any tiny little crevasse that might be around the edge of that while the epoxy dries. Now this is the border for my tray, which I started earlier on in the video. And now I'm going to nail the bottom on, getting that prepped. And I glue the bottom on. Oh, but first I flatten it out first with my sanding thing. That thing comes in handy. You wouldn't believe how convenient that is. You'll notice I had a piece of wood in there because the left and right sides were both had a slight bow in them to the center. So that little piece of wood just kept them separated in parallel. More hammering, which is very satisfying. And I'm feeling the whole time the side to make sure the nails don't poke through. Because if they poke through and I drive them home, it's impossible to get out. So if I feel them poking through, I'll stop. Ooh. Oh, I was so happy at this point because this was a culmination of a lot of work. And you'll notice there I'm hammering with that steel weight. It's the only way to really drive that small nail home in that oak with a steel brick behind it. Now these handles I bought on eBay. They're vintage toolbox handles, and they were sort of rusty gray, so I spray painted them gold. Just using some wipe-on poly right here on everything here. It's nice. And wipe-on poly. And I used a little acetone to get rid of the epoxy around those brass clips. That's why you saw kind of like a little stain there. You'll notice I used the pencil to sort of give me an indication of where that is going to live in the center of this object. Pre-drill everything, and now I'm using the gold paint again. Just to dab on the head of those screws, just to create the illusion that everything is the same tonality. And I heat stamp it with my Tony Verlew heat stamp, and of course there was a divot in the wood, so I'm going back in there with my Sharpie to complete the beautiful hot stamp. And we are done, thankfully. This was a long build because I was going up with it and down with it and up with it and down with it between the two shops. That's why I ended up kissing the box before, because I got to a point where I knew I could see the end of the project. This was a really fun build, and I really like this box, and I just love making my own toolboxes. It's sort of an heirloom project, and somebody somewhere is going to buy that at a flea market in 100 years.